generally in the United States, we are blessed to have very high quality drinking water. And I don't want this study that reveals this new byproduct to drive more people away from their tap.
This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. I'm Nate Potker. The United States has benefited from centuries of improvements in drinking water safety, and most Americans can trust that clean water comes from their taps. But contaminants can come into systems from harmful bacteria, leaching of lead, copper, and microplastic particles from plumbing hardware, or even human error when a clean water line is accidentally connected to a contaminated one. We are joined by Julian Fairey, Associate Professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Arkansas, whose research group focuses on drinking water treatment and understanding the natural organic matter and disinfection byproducts that result from water treatment processes. Professor Fairey, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Thinking about the water system a little bit as we ease into it, can you talk about the general structure at all? Like, for people that don't know anything about how it works, are these broken down by region or city?
Certainly both in some cases. Most, certainly big cities have multiple drinking water treatment plants. Some regions that are more rural regions, they'll have like a more sort of centralized drinking water treatment plant that supplies a fairly vast area. And so kind of how I think of drinking water treatment being broken down is by groundwater or surface water. And groundwater treatment is typically a little bit more simple. We think of, kind of well water, if you grew up in the country, as being fairly high quality water, not a lot of particles in it. And so the treatment can be quite minimal in that regard. And, there's many cities. Houston, for example, uses a lot of groundwater wells. Now they blend that with surface water sources. And when you do that, surface water in general, they're exposed to the atmosphere, all the different elements. And that's where we think of a little bit more advanced treatment being absolutely necessary in order to protect human health.
So how do we treat water?
Well, really, we want to get the stuff out of it. And so particles that you can see in your water glass, if you hold up a water glass and it's got things floating around in them, you're not going to have a sense that's safe. And that's a good instinct to adhere to. And so we want to get particles out of it, and we want to stabilize it from a bacteria, stabilize it from a microbiological standpoint as well. So get the particles out, disinfect it. And so really what that requires is making these particles, when they come into a water treatment plant from like a river source or a lake source, for example, the particles are generally pretty small. And so what we typically do is we add coagulants and mix at a relatively gentle rate in order to make bigger particles form that subsequently settle and we can filter out. In addition, we add chemical disinfectants to kill bacteria, inactivate microorganisms. And when we send off the water through a series of pipes that we refer to as the distribution system, that enters all our homes. And so we can basically drink clean water on demand.
Thinking about some of the chemicals that are added, what kind of chemicals are we using in the process to disinfect drinking water?
So there are a number of chemicals used in the United States. We break those chemicals into what we refer to as primary disinfectants, so disinfectants that are used in the drinking water treatment plant, and then secondary disinfectants, chemicals that are used within the drinking water distribution system. And so these chemicals can be very similar or a little bit different between primary and secondary disinfection. The most common disinfectant used in the United States and worldwide is chlorine. People in my field usually refer to this as free chlorine because we distinguish free chlorine from the second most common type of disinfectant, which are chloramines, which are often referred to as combined chlorine. So chloramines are created by reactions between free chlorine and ammonia. And so most drinking water systems in the United States use free chlorine as a primary disinfectant. The majority of water systems also use free chlorine as a secondary disinfectant. But about 1/3 of water systems in the United States use chloramines as a secondary disinfectant. And so let's say between free chlorine and chloramines, those make up the bulk of our drinking water disinfection in the United States. There are utilities that use other, certainly primary disinfectants. Ozone is a fairly common one. Chlorine dioxide is something that's used at many places around the United States, including where I live in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And so, but in terms of drinking water disinfectants in the distribution system, secondary disinfectants, these are typically free chlorine, chloramines, and there may be a small handful of systems that use chlorine dioxide.
All of these processes have byproducts, and I understand that's quite a bit of what you've studied over the years. Can you talk a little bit about some of these byproducts that result from treatment?
Sure. All these disinfectants, they inactivate microorganisms, which is their primary purpose, but they're also oxidants, and they react with naturally occurring organic materials that are naturally present in drinking waters. Some of these reactions result in the formation of unintended compounds that we just generically refer to as disinfection byproducts. And so this was first realized in I would say the mid-1970s, where there were some studies done to show that free chlorine, if you just add it to a drinking water, it reacts with this organic matter that's naturally present in the drinking water systems, and it forms it forms a compound called chloroform. Chloroform is part of a group of trihalomethanes, and so it was realized in the early or in the mid-1970s that these unintended compounds formed. Subsequently, through toxicity tests and things like this, we realized, okay, we need to regulate these groups of disinfection byproducts that formed. And so, say in the mid-1990s, we regulated trihalomethanes and another group of disinfection byproducts called allylacetic acids. And these are two groups of disinfection byproducts that, on a mass basis, form at the highest concentrations in chloraminated waters. In the last 50 years, we've found 600 to 700 disinfection byproducts forming out of all sorts of combinations of disinfectant regimes, natural organic matter types, as well as like different background ions that are in water, like bromide and chloride. And so that's one group of disinfection byproducts. The other group that I've been more interested lately are products that form from the disinfectant alone. So they don't need natural organic matter or anything other than the disinfectant. And so we've long known when chlorine dioxide, for example, decomposes, it forms chlorite, and this is regulated in our drinking water systems. But there's been this mystery compound associated with chloramines that we know that's formed. We've known this since 1980, but we haven't been able to identify. And that's what my work in the last 10 years has been about, trying to go about identifying this compound that is a natural decomposition product of chloramine disinfection.
So can you talk about that chloronitromide anion? Like, why was that of interest or a mystery?
The story starts back in 1980. There was a PhD thesis out of Cal Berkeley that showed when we're monitoring the two principal disinfectant compounds in chloramine systems, monochloramine and dichloramine, when we monitor those over time, there was two methods at the time to determine their concentrations. And initially, these two methods were giving the same result for monochloramine and dichloramine. But over time, basically these two methods diverted from one another. One of the methods was based on UV absorbance. And so what they were able to determine was, as chloramines are breaking down, they're forming this compound that creates an ultraviolet interference with one of these methods that they were using. And so they knew this unknown compound was forming that subsequently became known to people in my field as the unidentified product. was a stable product that formed during chloramine decomposition, and it was just a mystery of what this thing was. There was a lot of work done in the 1980s and 90s, primarily by Rich Valentine out of the University of Iowa, that was aimed at trying to identify this mystery compound. And they did a lot of really innovative work in chloramine chemistry, and that's the work we built on. And so they developed methods to form this compound at relatively high concentrations. When you want to try to identify something, that's one strategy, one really effective strategy for going about that, trying to form this thing at very high concentrations, see if you can apply some other analytical techniques to it. And so they formed this mystery compound that I'll just refer to as the unidentified product now, at relatively high concentrations. They weren't able to determine its molecular formula or its structure, but they were able to break it down and showed that it contained chlorine and nitrogen. So that was a hint. They also showed that materials that are in point of use filters, so like a Brita filter, for example, was able to destroy this compound. And so that was a useful insight on the treatment side of things. If people don't want to be exposed to this compound, perhaps a home water filter would be effective in removing it. But they ultimately weren't able to identify this compound. And so when I got into chloramine chemistry work, I was basically a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, and I was looking at how chloramines reacted with activated carbon. It was for a completely different process unrelated to this mystery compound, but it got me into chloramine chemistry. And subsequently, when I started my faculty job here at the University of Arkansas, I was looking for a fundamental way to explain the formation of a group of disinfection byproducts in chloramine systems that are called nitrosamines. NDMA is the most prominent nitrosamine that forms in drinking water chloramination. And we were together with a colleague of mine at USEPA, who was a grad student colleague, a friend from graduate school. His name is Dave Wong, and he works at USEPA in Cincinnati. We set about trying to explain how nitrosamines formed in chloramine systems. So I got a grant funded by the National Science Foundation back in 2020 to try to better explain how nitrosamines form in chloramine systems. And what we showed was when chloramines decompose, they form reactive nitrogen species. And this was a sort of a big leap forward in the science of chloramine decomposition. Really filled in a major gap from the original work done by Valentine and his colleagues back in the 1980s and 90s. So what we showed specifically was when chloramines decompose under drinking water conditions, monochloramine decomposes to dichloramine, and then dichloramine undergoes hydrolysis, meaning it reacts with water to form nitroxyl. And nitroxyl is this really interesting reactive nitrogen species that has a number of functions, both like physiology, but also as it turns out, in our chloramine systems. And what we showed was nitroxyl reacts with dissolved oxygen, which is present in all our waters just naturally, and forms another reactive nitrogen species called peroxynitrite. And peroxynitrite, as it turns out, decays rapidly to things that we are really familiar with in drinking water treatment, nitrite and nitrate. But along the way, it forms a whole host of reactive oxygen and nitrogen species. And turns out some of these species were key in the formation of NDMA, these nitrosamines. We also realized in this work that peroxynitrite decomposition products were involved in the formation of this mystery compound. So we did some studies under both low and ambient dissolved oxygen conditions that showed this mystery compound was mitigated under low DO conditions, meaning that peroxynitrite or its decomposition products was likely involved in its formation. So this kind of brought us back to seeking to identify this mystery compound now. And so, as you might get a sense, the chemistry of this system is starting to get pretty complicated. And this happened to coincide with my sabbatical year here at the University of Arkansas. And I was like, I need to solve this problem. And so where can I go to do this? And so one of the reviewers on one of our NDMA papers was Chris McNeil. He is a professor at ETH Zurich. And he had reached out just sort of with a congratulatory message regarding one of our papers after it published. Very nice. And this kind of started up a conversation of, hey, can I come over there and do a sabbatical and maybe look at this problem of this mystery product? He's more of a trained chemist, and I'm more of an environmental engineer. And so this worked out. It was great. I went over there and spent a year in Switzerland trying to identify this mystery compound. And Chris had an analytical chemist in his group named Julian Fairey, who was a postdoc, still is a postdoc in his group. And she just has really strong analytical skills. And so we set out, trying to identify this compound with some of the equipment over in Switzerland in Chris's lab and at a neighboring lab called AVOG. And that's really where the kind of like this story started getting interesting in terms of having some success at identifying this compound.
Right. And you said something as simple as like a home water filter can remove it from that water system.
And so what was shown by Rich Valentine and his colleagues is back in the 1980s and 90s, when we still referred to this compound as the unidentified product, he showed that the unidentified product can be removed by activated carbon, which is a material that's in point of use filters, typically in a fridge or pitcher filter that could be in your house. We haven't validated that yet with chloronitromide anion specifically, so we think that should work. There's testing that's about to start at US EPA in Cincinnati in this regard, evaluating point of use filters for chloronitromide anion removal. I think in the interim, if people are worried about their exposure to this compound, I think a fridge filter or something like that is a prudent strategy. One of the things we're interested along with that is, when we think of activated carbon to remove compounds from water, we typically think of absorption type mechanism. This product is likely a reaction type mechanism, meaning that it's going to react on the surface of these materials, these filter materials, and produce other products. And so we're interested not only in its removal, but what products it forms. It's likely that it might form something like nitrite. We actually showed that in the science paper when we basically hit this compound with light under photolysis, that one of the products is nitrite. And nitrite has its own host of health effects. It's likely it's going to form nitrite at relatively low levels, but we're interested to see what these end products are of the point of use filtering as well. And so there's a lot to be learned there, but I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a home water filter will be effective at removing the compound. Our drinking water in the United States is safe. Doesn't mean it can't be improved. There are a great many researchers like myself that are trying to do that on a day-to-day and year-to-year basis. The solution is not to drink bottled water. Bottled water comes from treated water, and it's usually just old treated water that's sitting there in a plastic bottle that's going to end up in a landfill. Generally, in the United States, we are blessed to have very high-quality drinking water. And I don't want this study that reveals this new byproduct to drive more people away from their tap. Now, that being stated, I think we have a responsibility to run this to ground, figure out its toxicological relevance, and we'll report that in a responsible and timely way. But in the meantime, if you're concerned about some of these disinfection byproducts that may be in our drinking water, point of use filter, fridge filter, something like that, I think can mitigate exposures. There's no reason to go away from treated drinking water. Our drinking water systems are marvels in this country. I know people like to say the infrastructure is old, and that is true in many cases. It can be, there is need for revitalization and more research in the context in those types of areas. But it's not to say that our drinking water is anything but safe.
I want to ask you about your career award and NSF support. What kind of difference has that made to your career?
Certainly, the career award was a launching pad for a lot of the work that I'm doing now. It's not directly related, but it was certainly on the topic of disinfection byproducts. I was as part of my career award, I was looking at carbonaceous absorption, carbonaceous absorbents, specifically carbon nanomaterials, and their possible utility for removing some of the organic precursors of disinfection byproducts. I think along the way, I basically convinced myself that, there are other more interesting aspects of drinking water chemistry other than what my career award was specifically about, but it allowed me the freedom to kind of start exploring these areas of disinfectant chemistry, which I have found to be a lot more fruitful. And so, one of the great things about a career award is just the flexibility of what it allows you to do. If you kind of get into it and you realize, hey, it makes a lot more sense to zig here instead of zag. The NSF is, as long as you're being productive, that's what they care about, as opposed to like making you follow like the plan that you specified down to a T. And so I would say the flexibility that the career award allowed, really sort of launched me into this work that I'm currently doing on disinfectant chemistry. And so the award itself, I think there was some nice results out of it. I don't know how important it is from a standpoint of how we treat our waters, but it did allow them to get into this work that I've been talking about regarding nitrosamines and disinfectant chemistry. And I think really is really fundamental to how we treat our waters and may guide improvements to drinking water disinfection moving forward.
Special thanks to Julian Fairey. For the Discovery Files, I'm Nate Podker. Please subscribe wherever you get podcasts, and if you like our program, share with a friend and consider leaving a review. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.